It was March 17, 2008, when Justice Hugh Bennett of the High Court of England and Wales delivered a ruling that the tabloids would chew over for years. Seated in London's Royal Courts of Justice, he finalized the financial annex of one of the most fractious celebrity divorces in British legal history. Paul McCartney, the Beatle who had written Hey Jude and maybe I'm Amazed, walked away with his reputation largely intact. His ex-wife, Heather Mills, was described by the judge in his written ruling as a less than impressive witness who had been deliberately less than candid. High Court of Justice Case No. FD 06D03721, 2008. She was awarded £24.3 million, a sum far less than she had sought, but one that nonetheless secured her financial future. The world assumed that was the end of the story. A bitter legal squabble over money, a judge's rebuke, and a former model cast as the villain who tried to take a legend for everything he had. But a secret doesn't die in a courtroom. It waits. And years later, long after microphones were turned off, Heather Mills began to articulate a different accusation, not about greed or legal malfeasance, but about a quiet, devastating truth. She claimed that Paul McCartney had carried a secret into their marriage, a psychological blueprint so deeply embedded that it doomed them from the beginning. That secret, she finally exposed, was not infidelity or financial manipulation. It was the pathological inability to dismantle a shrine. To understand what Heather uncovered, one must first walk into the house at Peasmarsh, East Sussex. This was the sprawling, rustic farmhouse where Paul had lived with Linda McCartney for nearly 3 decades. After Linda's death from breast cancer in 1998, the property became something more than a home. It became a reliquary. In interviews given after the divorce, most notably to the Daily Mail in 2012 and later in a candid podcast with The Sun's executive editor Dan Wooten in 2020, Heather described arriving as a new bride only to discover that every wall, every shelf, every corner was curated to memorialize a ghost. There were plaques on the walls, Heather recalled, concrete plaques with messages chiseled into them. One just said, "I love Linda." Another was by the deep fat friar. It was a shrine. She explained that the bedroom remained a museum of Paul's first marriage. Photographs of Linda were not relegated to a family album. They were displayed in the private quarters she was expected to share with Paul. Wardrobe space was minimal because Linda's clothes still hung in closets, preserved like artifacts. When Heather gently suggested redecorating or moving even a single photograph to a different room, she claims Paul reacted with a silent, stony resistance. The secret, as Heather frames it, was not that Paul missed Linda. Grief is no secret. The secret was that he had made a solemn, unconscious pact to never let the physical environment acknowledge any other woman. Heather was not moving into a home. She was being granted temporary visiting rights to a mausoleum. The most piercing detail of Heather's revelation concerns a piece of jewelry, not a diamond, not an heirloom, but a simple gold band. According to multiple accounts from friends of the couple, including a revealing 2006 piece in The Times that interviewed several of Paul's former associates, Paul wore Linda's wedding ring on his right hand continuously after her death. Heather confirmed this in her 2020 podcast appearance. Going further, she claimed Paul wore it every single day of their courtship and engagement. The ring was a tactile anchor to Linda, a piece of metal that had touched Linda's skin for 29 years, now wrapped around Paul's finger as a surrogate for her presence. Heather alleges that the removal of this ring did not happen weeks or months before their wedding. It happened the night before the ceremony. She paints a picture of the eve of their nuptials at Castle Leslie in Ireland. Paul is alone, perhaps looking out a window, and he slides the thin gold band off his finger for the first time in nearly 4 years. He placed it in a drawer or a box. The next morning, he put on a new ring, the one symbolizing his union with Heather. For an objective observer, this is not a story of a man who has completed his grieving. It is a story of a man who performed grief externally while suspending it internally. The secret buried beneath the wedding vows was that Paul had never psychologically uncoupled from Linda. He had merely paused the ritual of wearing her ring, intending to resume it the moment the new marriage inevitably failed. Heather realized too late, that she had married a man who was still, in every meaningful emotional sense, married to someone else. Heather Mills was not an inexperienced naif when she met Paul at a charity gala in 1999. Her own biography is one of survival and fierce independence, a fact often omitted from the tabloid caricature. Born in 1968, she endured a traumatic childhood, left home at 15, and built a successful modeling career before a catastrophic accident in 1993. While crossing a street in London, a police motorcycle struck her, leading to the amputation of her left leg below the knee. Rather than retreating into victimhood, Heather became a prominent campaigner against landmines, testifying before the United Nations, and even faking her own kidnapping in war zones to draw media. Attention to the cause, BBC News, Heather Mills, A Life in the Headlines, 2007. This background is crucial because it reframes her later complaints. She was not a fragile ingenue easily threatened by a shadow. She was a woman who had lost a limb and rebuilt her life through sheer will. When she says she found living in Linda's house psychologically unbearable, she speaks as someone who understands genuine adversity. The secret she exposes is that Paul exploited her resilience. She argues that he chose her precisely because she was a survivor, someone who had coped with catastrophic loss and might therefore tolerate his unresolved grief without collapsing. He never intended to heal with her. He intended to use her as a buffer against his own loneliness while preserving the museum of his first marriage intact. The secret extends beyond physical objects into the realm of ritual and daily life. Heather revealed that Paul maintained several immutable traditions designed around Linda's memory. For example, he insisted on celebrating certain weekends at the Peasmarsh farmhouse in the exact manner he and Linda had, down to the same vegetarian recipes prepared in the same way, the same walks through the same fields, the same silence in the same chairs by the fireplace. When Heather attempted to introduce new traditions, such as taking a holiday somewhere Linda had never visited, Paul would become withdrawn or irritable. In a 2016 interview with The Mirror that resurfaced during a later documentary, Heather described Christmas at the McCartney household as a ritualized performance of grief. Gifts were wrapped in a particular style Linda had favored. Certain songs were played at specific volumes. There was a chair at the dinner table that remained empty, Linda's chair. No one was permitted to sit there. For 6 years, Heather watched an empty chair dominate every family gathering. She finally understood the secret. Paul did not want a new wife. He wanted a living actress to play a role in the ongoing theater of his bereavement. He wanted an audience for his suffering, not a partner for his future. Perhaps the most psychologically complex element of Heather's exposure involves Paul's relationship with his own children, particularly his daughter Stella McCartney. Heather has claimed, without naming names but through clear implication, that Paul's inner circle, including his adult children, actively resisted her presence because they viewed her as a threat to Linda's legacy. This is not merely petty jealousy. Stella, a world-renowned fashion designer, has spoken publicly about her mother's influence on her life and work. In a 2018 interview with Vogue, Stella described her mother as the fabric of our family. Heather's allegation is that Paul's children colluded, consciously or not, in the preservation of the shrine. They would visit the Peasmarsh house and behave as if Heather were invisible, addressing Paul, and the house as if Linda had just stepped out for a moment. Heather recalls one incident where a family photograph was taken, and she was deliberately positioned at the edge of the frame, half out of focus. When she objected, she was told she was being difficult. The secret Heather finally articulated is that Paul never disciplined this behavior. He never stood in the kitchen and said, "This is Heather, my wife, and she is the lady of this house now." His passivity was a form of complicity. He allowed his family to treat Heather as an interloper because, in his heart, he agreed with them. She was an interloper in the cathedral of his memory. One of the most overlooked documents in this entire saga is not a court filing, but a musical one. In 2001, before he even proposed to Heather, Paul released the album Driving Rain, much of which was inspired by his grief for Linda. The song Magic contains the lyric, I held you close to me, I felt your heart beating, I thought I'd never let you go. That is a man singing to a ghost. But more telling is the album he was working on during his separation from Heather in 2006 to 2007. Memory Almost Full, a title that deliberately plays on the phrase memory almost full, is a meditation on aging and loss. Yet, nowhere on that album does Paul thank Heather or reference their brief marriage. The album is essentially a continuation of his dialogue with Linda. Heather's secret, as exposed in her rare and carefully worded interviews, is that Paul's artistic output during their marriage never included her. She was a blank space in his creative narrative. While he wrote songs for Linda, My Love, Maybe I'm Amazed, and later wrote a tender song for his third wife Nancy Shevell called My Valentine, there is no comparable love song for Heather. She claims she realized one night, listening to him play piano in the studio, that she was musically invisible to him. He couldn't write a love song for me, she told the Daily Telegraph in 2014, because his love song capacity was already fully occupied, permanently. The final secret Heather exposed concerns the settlement itself, but not the money. During the 2008 trial, Justice Bennett made a peculiar observation in his sealed remarks, later partially leaked to the Evening Standard. He noted that Paul McCartney's offer of £15.8 million was generous and that Heather's rejection of it was unreasonable. But buried in the judge's reasoning was a concession that the non-financial aspects of the marriage had been unusually challenging for Heather. Legal analysts at the time, including The Guardian's legal correspondent Afua Hirsch, pointed out that the term unusually challenging was code for something the court could not adjudicate, emotional unavailability. Heather could not sue Paul for still being in love with Linda. There is no legal remedy for marrying a widower who has not processed his loss. And so she accepted the money less than she had hoped, more than most will ever see, as a transactional acknowledgement that the emotional contract of marriage had been broken before the ink was dry. The secret she carried out of that courtroom was that the British legal system had no vocabulary for the specific cruelty of being a replacement ghost. She was not a gold digger, she insists. She was a placeholder, and placeholders, by their nature, are ultimately discarded. In the years since the divorce, Paul McCartney has remarried Nancy Shevell, a calm, private businesswoman who seems to have navigated the Linda shadow more successfully. Nancy does not live full-time in the Peasmarsh farmhouse. The couple splits time between New York and London. She has never given an interview about feeling compared to Linda. Some observers suggest that Nancy succeeded where Heather failed precisely because she did not try to compete. She accepted the shrine. She did not ask Paul to remove the plaques or move the photographs. She simply built a separate life alongside them, not inside them. But Heather's exposure suggests a darker interpretation, that Paul learned nothing from his first post-Linda marriage. He simply found a woman who would tolerate what Heather could not. The secret, then, is not that Paul was a bad man. It is that he was a tragically honest one. He loved Linda with such totality that every subsequent relationship was doomed to be measured against an impossible standard. Heather Mills, for all her flaws and her documented inconsistencies in court, performed a valuable public service. She clarified that sometimes the villain in a story is not a person but a memory, and the secret that finally broke her marriage was not hidden in a vault or a safety deposit box. It was hanging on every wall of the home she was told would be hers. It was engraved on plaques. It was sitting in an empty chair at Christmas dinner. And the tragedy, as Heather finally exposed, is that Paul McCartney never once looked at that empty chair and asked himself whether he was ready to fill it with a living, breathing woman who deserved a love that was not a memorial.